You're listening to The Wintermaker, read to you by author Jason Lee Willis. Part 8, Chapter 33, Whetstone, Sterling Junction, October 18th, 1961. Rory Stewart's body was found beneath the Blue Knife River Bridge. Wally Crane reread the front page news article, focusing on the details after the shock wore off from the headlines. Everything written in the Minneapolis Tribune echoed what Wally had already learned yesterday when the boy had been found. The dining room was strangely silent, and despite his wife sitting in front of her typewriter, there would be no writing this Writing Wednesday. Most Wednesday mornings over the past decade, Nancy carefully stacked the finished chapters of her novel to the right of the typewriter and placed her notebooks of ideas to the left. She took time once a week to nurture a role as an aspiring novelist. During the summer, his wife filled notebooks with ideas under the big willow tree in their backyard. Her love of symbolism, metaphor, and mythology led her to create a series of novels inspired by famous stories placed in a modern setting. Wally had seen cover pages for at least 3 of these works: Hamlet's Ghost, Cassandra's Curse, and Ulysses' Bow. Today, the sheet of paper she slid into the typewriter held the same 2 sentences they held at 5 a.m. Wally gave her space, putting aside the novel and moving to place his cereal bowl in the sink before heading out to the garage to arm himself for battle. When was the last time I saw Rory? The camping trip? The Blue Knife River was 2 miles east of St. John, so the boy had either walked out of town of his own volition or was abducted and brought there. The reports could not yet identify whether the boy had been killed first and then dropped over the edge of the bridge, or if he had been killed by the fall. Regardless, authorities admitted that 2 boys falling to their deaths near Lake Manitou in the span of 1 month was more than coincidence, especially since Rory Stewart's backpack was found tossed in the bushes just outside the Stewart property on Monday night. His body was found on Tuesday morning. Semper Fortis, Wally thought as he searched for the small can of oil in the garage. Always courageous. Back in the kitchen, Wally heard the paper torn from the typewriter. Wally moved to the counter where he'd spread out 3 kitchen towels to clean his weapons: a small jackknife, a horrifying hooked blade with a wooden handle, and a disassembled pistol. With his small can of oil, he finished cleaning the pistol and began reassembling it. Unfortunately, Nancy finished writing an hour ahead of schedule. "What do you think you are doing?" The lighting was terrible in the garage," Wally said as he worked on the old pistol. "The girls will be waking up in an hour, and I do not want them seeing this exhibition displayed on the kitchen counter. It will alarm them." "Are you still taking them to school?" "Of course I'm taking them to school. We're going to keep on living regardless of what happened to the Stewart boy." "They're going to want to talk to the children today, especially with MEA break beginning tomorrow. Are you going to speak with the girls or wait for their teachers to do it?" "I was going to speak to them before, but I don't want to have to begin the conversation because they saw their father oiling a pistol in the kitchen." "Where did you even get that?" "Father Gene Guerin." "It's a Colt 1872 open top. It's an heirloom. My dad gave it to me after Lily Guerin gave it to him after her husband Gene died." He finished putting the chamber back together, spun it, and slapped it into place. "Someone's killing kids, Nancy." "Who suddenly made you deputy?" "If I'm driving around Hiawatha County and see something strange happening, I need this with me." In fact, he'd been on the job when Rory Stewart vanished after school Monday. He'd even personally spoken to Sheriff Betzing on the phone to let him know that he'd driven the road between St. John and Split Rock during the late afternoon. According to Red Doby, who logged the delivery, Wally arrived at the Hager Quarry at 3:35 for a fuel delivery. St. John dismissed at 3 o'clock. Rory Stewart had not gone home after school. His body had been... Again and again, Wally replayed his route on Monday, hoping to remember something that would identify what happened to one of his boys. Nancy took the newspaper from the table and put it in the garbage. "Well, put the pistol back together and get it out of sight. I understand what you're doing, but I do not want this in the house again." Wally shrugged. He knew what had happened back in 1898. Lily Guerin claimed she'd woken the Manitou when she practiced the ancient rituals taught to her by her grandfather Nanak. With the floodgates opened, the evil spirits, the Takpai, that guarded their master, fed on the deaths that happened around Lake Manitou. With each death, the creatures grew stronger and stronger until they were capable of taking on corporeal form. 12 folks died that year in random fashion, from murder to tragic accidents. 4 dead at Carousel Park, now 2 boys. They're halfway there. I'll drive you and the girls to school today. I'll just shift my deliveries back a few hours. Well, why don't you go get them, and I'll tell them what happened. It's certain to be talked about at school. A few minutes later, Nancy herded the girls into the kitchen. They're too young to deal with this stuff, Wally hesitated. But they have to know. Girls, there's something I need to speak to you about. You'll certainly be hearing about it at school, but I want to talk to you about it first. A boy from St. John died yesterday, Rory Stewart. The police are searching for the person who hurt him. Janet's brow furrowed. Damn, they understand the killer is still on the loose. You will certainly be safe while you're at school. Your teachers will probably talk to your classes about strangers and being safe. There are a lot of brave people out looking for answers, so you don't have anything to worry about, okay? Margaret looked to be on the verge of tears, and Cindy seemed to be processing the details. But Janet quickly connected the dots, asking, "Is it the same man who killed Isaac Larson?" "We don't know exactly what happened to Isaac Larson, just like we don't know what happened to the Stewart boy who died yesterday. I'm certain the police will figure it out and keep us safe." "Wasn't Rory in Pack 88? Margaret asked. Nancy's eyes commanded him to stop, but Wally nodded. Yes, he was. As anticipated, other husbands and fathers accompanied their children to school. Wally stayed long enough to learn that Split Rock's superintendent had called the faculty together to distribute a press release prepared by Hiawatha County Sheriff's Department. After that, he retreated to a discreet distance where Ed Nielsen sat on his tailgate sipping coffee. "While I was filling up the gas, Bill Jensen told me he had a theory about a serial killer. He said he saw some sinister-looking Indian, tall, muscular fella, lurking around the Blue Knife River in recent days." "Leonard White Elk?" Wally asked. "He left a month ago." "Exactly. Albert was right about folks looking for a monster." Nielsen looked around the neighborhood beyond the school. "Any theories, aside from, "I keep replaying it in my mind," Wally admitted. "Rory had to have been abducted right outside of his house. If he'd walked out to the Blue Knife, I certainly would have seen him walking down the highway as I came into town." "No sinister red Thunderbirds?" "Marlon Looning said he spoke to a deputy about that incident back in June, but hell, that car vanished like a fart in the wind. I think it would be a tad conspicuous for a kidnapper to be driving around in it." "Why would Rory Stewart get in a car with a stranger?" Ed asked. Wally shook his head. "The guy must have grabbed him outside of his house, which explains the backpack being tossed in the bushes. I saw Sean at the exact same time his son was getting nabbed. I had to sign some new work orders at the quarry, and there they all sat, Haggard, Doby, Marquette, Stewart." Nielsen dumped the last of his coffee onto the ground. "I hate to think of it, but the pervert who took Rory kept him somewhere. Dumping the body at the bridge was like taking out the trash for this creep." "But it was strategic, too." Even so, folks are going to get put a lot of heat on the reservation. I should let Riel and McGeesey know what's being whispered on the winds. We're probably making matters worse sitting here, Nielsen said, preparing to leave. But I'm coming back at 3 to make sure some kid doesn't wander off and that my kids go straight home. I'll see you back at 3 too. I'm going to go speak with Albert and then drive around a bit. See you later, Ed. Wally left and drove just a few blocks away from school to Albert Fisher's estate. He parked at the garage instead of in front of the house to avoid having to talk with the man's nosy wife. Behind the glass in the garage doors, Albert had a collection of classic automobiles, but none of that mattered to Wally right now. Rory Stewart had been murdered. It's the only theory that makes sense. A few minutes later, the lights inside the garage came to life and the big garage door opened. Albert Fisher's face held the grief of an entire community. He thinks this is his fault. Wally quickly got to the point. What am I looking for? I wish I could give you a clear answer. Back in '98, a young boy drowned. There was an explosion at the creamery. 3 people were murdered, and the death of the killer made it 4. The Weber murders, Wally recalled, yet Rory Stewart was not an ally. Did anything ever happen to the folks from Triton? Now that you say it, I don't think... No, wait. I remember hearing something about one of them drowning in a bathtub. He was a businessman from out east, so no one knew him well. Folks assumed he had a bad heart. Before the incident at Deadwood Island, there were several random deaths. Perhaps my father was right about the Manitou. Or could it be something else? I've been thinking about speaking to Dobie about this red thunderbird the boys saw. Obviously, none of the guys at Triton would do something to endanger their own children, but in '98 it was Joseph Littletoad who tried to wake the Wintermaker. You're not trying to implicate Leonard White Elk, right? Oh, no, of course not. What if this guy the boys met in the Red Thunderbird was a false face to those guys at Triton? Human hands set fire at Lily Guerin's cabin, and human hands caused the roller coaster collapse. While we don't know what happened to the Larson boy, I'd bet his body was tossed from that cliff. Something had to have woken the Tokpai. The night this began, I had a vision, Albert revealed. The young man in the vision warned me they were fighting the Wintermaker in the future. Lily stood toe-to-toe with the Wintermaker and this Tokpai back in 1898, bringing the darkness to an end. What if this puppet master exists in the future and is manipulating events now? I don't know what to even say about that, Albert. I want to take hold of some son of a bitch by the throat, okay? Give me somebody to fight. A fight is coming, but it might not be that kind of fight. I do know one thing. We need to protect our children. I can get behind that notion. Wally Crane went to St. John, loaded his oil truck for deliveries, drove around Lake Manitou for a few hours, circled back to St. John where a television crew filmed, and returned to Split Rock by the end of the school day. Like several other fathers, he waited, leaning against his door at the back of the lot. One by one, the girls came rushing to him. 20 minutes after the bell, Nancy came out the side door also. She told him the elementary teachers overreacted with fear while the teenagers were swept away with anger. Your boys concerned me, though. Chris seemed reasonably focused, but Biff had obvious anger, and Jimmy seemed withdrawn. He seems frightened, too. What about the older kids, the Guerin girl? She's a hard nut to crack. She puts on a good show, that's for sure. I have no idea if any of this is bothering her. I think the MEA break will help. Wally doubted 4 days off school would let anyone forget about the death of 2 boys. If anything, it would make matters worse. Chapter 34, Bohica Blues, St. John, Minnesota, October 23rd, 1961. All of Hiawatha County seemed to mourn the death of Rory Stewart, and the gloom continued past the boy's funeral. A thick blanket of clouds hid the sun for an entire week, and during much of the time a steady rain fell, turning the gravel roads to a muddy maze for Wally. At several places along his delivery route, he had to back up to avoid water that filled the ditches and passed over the roads. While his truck had plenty of clearance, its weight threatened to sink right into the muddy base of the gravel roads. Both the Blue Knife and the Crow Wing rivers raged so wildly that Wally worried they would cut the county into 3 islands, forcing him to drive far to the north to pass safely over the waters. But, like the hearts of its residents, the waters swelled but did not break. At most stops, the residents came out of the house to chat while he filled their fuel tanks. Many kept the conversation superficial and polite, but several openly talked theory and conspiracy about the recent deaths. Wally shrugged off most of it, all the while keeping his pistol in the glove compartment. His inherited pistol almost brought the Manitou back to life in 1898, Wally realized. From what his father told him, Gene Guerin had come face to face with cult members from the Ouijigan clan, and even though he gunned them down in cold blood, the murders acted as a blood sacrifice to the Manitou, who surged to consciousness. Father Guerin's heroism backfired, and now we must be careful not to repeat the same mistake. Lily, or Tawapa Asabakashi as she was known back then, used magic from the dawn to battle the evil entity to a draw. She subdued the Manitou and his Takpai, and for decades the evil slumbered. Now Lily battled for breath. He'd visited her for guidance and to seek information about the mysterious visitor that both McGeesee and the boys had seen prior to the fire. He didn't get much more than what Nicky Guerin had told him already. At Haggard Quarry, Wally found some sure footing. Normally, the quarry road terrified him, but the narrow road cut out of stone was the sturdiest delivery he had made all week. Having spoken to Jimmy Nielsen, Biff Forsberg, and Chris Looning about their strange encounter with the fellow in the Red Thunderbird, he came away with some insight. While Jimmy and Chris both felt the paranormal danger, Biff focused on predators. And when asked for a recap of the details, he alluded to the fact that the Red Thunderbird had been coming from Haggard Quarry. It didn't make any sense. Not even Wally's job made sense right now. Wally looked to the far side of the quarry where the machines were buttoned up for the winter, as he stood for several minutes putting hundreds of gallons of fuel in the tank nearest Red's office. "Looks like you boys are closed down for the season," Wally said in passing. "Indeed we are. As soon as I get done with this paperwork, I'm going to do my best goose impersonation and fly south for the winter." "Ah, that's right. You're a snowbird, aren't you? Florida?" "Hell no. Swamp. I'm a rockhound. Arizona." "So if the quarry is closed down for the winter and you're off in Arizona, what's the deal with filling these tanks?" "I told you about this. Road construction is certainly done, but Haggard has this contract for the Blue Hone Granite." "Ah, yes, the knockoff curling stones. Haggard has some small crew working now that construction season has paid the bills. You know these guys?" Red stared over the top of his gold-rimmed glasses. "Playing detective?" I don't blame you after what happened to the Stewart boy. No stone unturned, huh?" Wally shrugged. The head engineer had visited a few times over the summer in preparation for the winter harvesting, but there's no stranger danger with him. He's got a tight alibi, too. Is that the theory now? A stranger? I'd have put my money on someone local, but, you know, they could be random incidents. Who the hell knows? When I was in the Navy, we had a saying, "Bend over, here it comes again." Bohica. Bohica, yeah. I feel like that also. Wally had known Red most of his adult life. He was part of the landscape of Hiawatha County. I don't mean to implicate your granite engineer. Sorry about that. Red blew it off with a huff. Sad shit, kid dying that young. It would be irresponsible not to ask questions. Right, so I hope you don't mind another, but you wouldn't happen to know anybody that drives a red Thunderbird, would you? A shiny new one? A car like that would stand out, wouldn't it? Why you ask? Got a lead or something? A few folks I know remember seeing one driving around earlier in the summer, and it approached a group of boys. Probably innocent, but now it seems suspicious. Where did you see this Thunderbird? Old Copper Road. Sorry, Wally. It was probably just someone who got lost looking for Carousel Park. He blew that off pretty quickly. Yeah, you're probably right. You have a good time in Arizona this winter. Yeah, I think I'll think of you each time I read about a blizzard. After leaving Red's office, Wally parked along the narrow isthmus of road between the quarry and lake. Out the driver window, he could see the pink wound in the ground. Past the passenger window, Lake Manitou rippled innocently. Because he felt like a frightened boy, Wally got out his father's castration knife and held it before him. While he told the boys the story of the Barlow knife, he didn't tell them what happened after his father was bullied in dreams by the Manitou. When it all became too intolerable, little Kermit returned with a sharpened castration knife in hand and stood fearlessly on the shore, pissing on the water with one hand and the castration knife in the other. The Manitou claimed a dozen souls in 1898, yet Lily and her original Santee Lodge had somehow defeated the evil. Now it was time for the new Santee Lodge. Lord, guide my thoughts and deeds in the days to come. Wally put the knife away when he left the shore. As he drove toward St. John, he reviewed the facts. BCA medical examiners had taken their time with the body of Rory Stewart, but once they finally released him for burial, and even though the funeral had been held, little more was known about the crime a week later. Wally stayed on the main road that led into the heart of St. John. His eyes wandered to the wooden shore where Stewart House overlooked Lake Manitou. His truck crossed the path Rory would have taken to get home, and a chill ran down his spine. Soon enough, he reached the Blue Knife River Bridge that connected the communities of St. John and Split Rock. The massive project had been completed prior to the Great Depression, allowing residents to make the trip in 10 minutes rather than the 30 it took to go around Lake Manitou to the south or across far to the north at the Nimrod Bridge. The steel girder bridge passed over the Blue Knife River a little less than 100 feet in the air. Even though Highway 34 dipped slightly while approaching the deep gorge, the bridge ran for almost 500 feet over the river, so that modern vehicles like his fuel truck did not have to expend much energy crossing the formidable natural obstacle. Wally didn't bother to slow down or look as he passed over the bridge. He'd seen the river 1,000 times in his life, with the Nicollet Dam Reservoir to the north and the sandbars that formed at the confluence of Lake Manitou to the south. Rory Stewart's body had been dumped onto the exposed rock, which was now covered by raging waters from the recent rains. Once out of the Blue Knife River Valley, he came to the intersection that led to either the state park to the south or the Nimrod Road to the north. He turned north. The Turtle Island Jesuit School, like other businesses and residences in the area, had also allowed their fuel supply to dwindle in the long spring, leaving its tanks almost empty as winter approached. After filling their tank, Wally drove out of the small reservation, but parked his truck alongside the road where it turned back east toward the Nimrod Road. Magisi Asabakashi lived like a hermit along the Blue Knife River, and Wally's boots were heavy with mud by the time he reached the small shack. The flooded Nicollet Reservoir had swallowed 4 feet ashore and now approached the bases of the old trees. "Magisi," Wally called out as he neared the old man's residence. "It's Wally Crane." Magisi didn't appear. When he reached the porch, he saw a stack of willow branches and rolls of sinew. Magisi was constructing dream catchers. Wally rapped loudly on the front door, but with scarcely a glance into the window, he could see McGeesy was not there. A dying fire burned in the middle of the yard, and past it, sheltered by tall pines, a freshly built sweat lodge stood a few feet from the edge of the river. If Wally hadn't seen other lodges in his life, he would have assumed a gigantic beaver had swallowed a tree and taken a crap, leaving a random pile of bark and branches. For all of its aesthetic ugliness, the sweat lodge did its job, exuding heat from the flap that marked its entrance. "Are you coming out, or am I coming in?" Wally asked as he gently knocked on the birch bark structure. The flap flew open, and McGeesy looked like a wet rat, stared at him. "What have I done to make Manabozho hate me so much?" Wally extended his hand, and McGeesy took hold to climb out of the lodge. "Why does Manabozho hate you, old man?" "He taunts me with signs of my enemy, but will not show me the path to take to fight him. I waited my whole life to fight the horned serpent, and now that he rises again, I am an old man. Why would he be so cruel?" "You've heard what happened to the Stewart boy?" "Ed Nielsen told me a few days ago. I have been in prayer ever since." "That's good. The authorities have no answers, do you?" "I have more questions than answers," McGeesy said. He wore only a pair of boxers, and from inside the doorway of the lodge, he pulled out a wool blanket that he draped on his shoulders. He led the way to the shack, threw open his front door, and walked directly to the old cast-iron stove in the middle of the room. He spent a few minutes stoking the cold coals until flames began to appear. Once satisfied, he walked over to the small bed and picked up a leather notebook, which he carried to Wally, extending it to him. "What's this?" "Death. Take it away from here." Wally found the notebook in notebooks in his fingers, but instead of opening it, he watched McGeesy dress himself and then begin to brew some coffee. "Are you going to explain?" "Children brought it to me. More likely or not, children who will be the next victims of the Takpai, for the contents of the notebook contain secrets that have long been guarded by the Metawewan, Jessica, and Wabano. Now white children possess the secrets and carry it around like an algebra book." "Who brought this to you?" "Nicole and her little puppy, the McPherson boy. He wouldn't follow her so willingly if he knew the truth about the blood that flows in her veins. The men of the dawn heap piles of children upon the altar, knowing evil will come to feast." For all of his bluster, McGeesy wasn't offering a plan. "How can he just sit here and let all this happen?" "What am I supposed to do?" "Get rid of that notebook. It was wrong for Garin to have written down secrets that should only be whispered in a sweat lodge. For his arrogance, he had to die twice, where most men need only to die once. My sister suffers because of the same arrogance." McGeesy's hands fluttered with agitation. "I don't care what you do with it, but know that as long as you have it, evil will be drawn to it, for it is both a threat and a prize to them." "Why are you afraid to keep it? You claim to be a warrior, yet seem to avoid a fight." McGeesy's wrinkled face seemed to constrict with hatred. "The Takpai sneak up to my cabin at night. I can hear them whispering and plotting, but when I rush out to battle them, they flee like smoke in the wind. They won't fight me." "Why?" "Because they know that their master is under my blade. I hold the knife to his throat, and any word from my sister, I could destroy all the plans of the Wintermaker." Wally's fists clenched with the rage as he fought to ask a question calmly. "Why don't you?" "Bah!" McGeesy dismissed him with a flail of his hands. "You are still an ignorant boy in the skin of a man. Would you destroy your house to put out a fire on the stove? Lily made a choice, and now I must defend it to my last breath, even if I wouldn't have made the choice myself." "I'm not sure what that means." "So, what do I do about the fire on the stove?" McGeesy ignored him long enough to gather 2 tin coffee cups and pour steaming coffee into them. Even though he was a bitter old man, McGeesy showed his affection by bringing 2 cubes of sugar for Wally. Wally put his hand over the cup. "How could you end all of this right now, McGeesy? What do you mean with your comment about a knife to the throat?" "The Wintermaker cannot rise without 3 sacred items. My sister and I guard one. As long as we live, we will hold back the waters." Wally removed his hand, and McGeesy dropped the cubes into the coffee. For a few moments, both men sipped away at the coffee in silence. "Fawn Chevril is dead," McGeesy said to break the silence. "Her son Leonard and grandson Benjamin came and visited me for a week in early September." Benjamin. What kind of name is that? Did he forget he already told me? Wally restrained himself from cruelty. "Benjamin is from the Bible. He was the beloved son of Jacob. Well, he and Leonard have both begun their training in the secrets of the Ouija-gon and the Song of the Manitou. They know enough should I die this winter." "Do you know something that I don't?" "It is not my health that worries me." "You worry about the Wintermaker and his talk pie." "For being a young man still, Leonard is surprisingly wise, and it was prudent that he left Lake Manitou when he did." "Why is it prudent? Won't we need his help in fighting the Wintermaker?" "We do not fight the Wintermaker," McGeesy said flatly. "I don't... What do you mean? Why do you come to me for counsel when you don't listen? I just told you we do not fight the Wintermaker, yet you want more information about an enemy that is irrelevant. Fine, let me speak to you as if you're a child. The horned serpent that torments Ayash, that is not our enemy. The Manitou that lurks in the water, that is not our enemy. The great shape-shifting bear known as No Soul, that is not our enemy. This enemy with many names is the concern of future generations. We'll be bones and dust long before we have to concern ourselves with this evil being." Wally was losing patience, but he knew McGeesy was an important ally. "Okay, McGeesy, I understand your point. Who do we fight?" "We fight Summer," McGeesy said with a smirk. "Garen came to us because the Black Robes understood the true face of evil far better than my grandfather did. The Ouija-gon stood too close to the fire to understand the difference between the light and the darkness. I remember hearing the tale from Nana Conan, but only now that I am old do I understand it." "Fighting Summer is impossible?" Wally surmised. "The seasons change, and there is nothing that can be done to stop it." "Not necessarily. Long ago, and still to come, there was a man, the Wintermaker, who wanted to stop time. And after studying the truth about the world, he noticed how the summer birds would come and go with the changing of the seasons. Did the summer birds arrive because of the seasons, or did the seasons arrive because of the summer birds? I think so. The Wintermaker began to collect the summer birds. At first, no one noticed, for who would miss a single summer bird? But after a while, the Wintermaker had so many birds in his trap that the seasons could not change. The terrible winter fell upon the world. The animals were bewildered, so the Fisher Cat was sent to the lands of the north to investigate. He found the summer birds locked away in a cage, and the herring watched over them. While the Fisher Cat was not strong enough to battle the Wintermaker, he was able to fight the herring. And during the fierce battle, he found enough time to unlock the cage and free some of the summer birds. Even though some remained in the cage, enough escaped to usher in a new summer, and time continued to move. "So that's what's happening here?" Wally asked. "The summer birds are slowly collecting in a cage?" "When I was your age, I wanted to fight the Wintermaker too," McGeesy replied. "It is easier to fight the herring than the Wintermaker." "I must find the herring," Wally said, even if he wasn't sure he understood the metaphors. The herring is my enemy. The herring is the servant of the Wintermaker, but the enemy of the Wintermaker is the coming summer. He collects the summer birds in his cage to keep the summer from arriving. For in his great wisdom, he knows that a terrible summer of fire and water will come to destroy him. It is good to save the summer birds from the cage, but you must also understand that the Creator sends summer birds north, knowing they will be captured. For the terrible summer can only arrive once the fisher cat has freed all the summer birds from the cage. Wally sighed loudly enough to end the lesson. McGeesy began tending to the empty coffee cups. As he collected Wally's cup, he said, "You asked me who we fight, but I must speak in metaphors. If you fight the herring, you may free a bird or two. But if you leave the gate open and all the summer birds escape without being led back south, all will be lost." This is ridiculous. To keep his frustration in check, Wally focused on the leather notebook in his hands. "Have you read this?" Mostly half-truths, but then again, I might be wrong. And Father Guerin might be right. Who knows? I would have thrown it in the fire myself, but then it occurred to me that the men of the Dawn burned Lily's house to either kill my sister or destroy the notebook. But why would Eos wait so long to act? Triton men have known about Lily for decades now. McGeesy's hand went to a metal bowl and retrieved a small metal object, which he tossed sharply at Wally. It bounced against his thick canvas jacket, but Wally caught the rebound. In his hand, he held the metal head of a lighter. Care to explain? The McPherson boy told quite a tale. He said that when he ran around to the backside of Tu's house, the ground in front of her house was on fire as if someone had poured fuel around the house. Nicole said she found the lighter on the edge of the fire, and not far away in the woods, she found an empty fuel can. Ed and I already suspected arson. Why did they wait? Wally knew it was too late to make accusations, and even if they'd been the one to find that night, he knew tangling with Eos or Triton meant he needed concrete evidence. "This is not the act of a servant," McGeesy said. The Wintermaker bought a Bic lighter. What do you mean? The Wintermaker and his servants know they can outlast Lily and me. They understand the truce forged so many summers ago. Something changed, and instead of waiting for my sister to die, an enemy struck first. Whoever set the fire is acting independently of their master. McGeesy looked into Wally's eyes. Your enemy is not Eos. As Father Guerin once explained to me, evil is often a house divided. The Red Thunderbird? That's what he's saying. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Father Guerin argued that the Asante Lodge needed to make a stand against evil. Leonard White Elk recently tried to convince me that prophecy will not be fulfilled for another century, and that I should do nothing. You and I must walk the line between these two philosophies. To save the summer birds? McGeesy nodded. Souls are like fuel to the Tok'pai. When Tu battled the Wintermaker long ago, she trapped the Tok'pai on Deadwood Island. If Leonard is right, the Wintermaker should simply wait. But instead, someone is purposefully waking the Tok'pai before the proper time. I just don't understand why. But I know this. The Tok'pai are again growing stronger. And when they grow strong enough, they will rally behind their master like hornets protecting their nest. Wally slipped the leather notebook into the pocket inside his jacket. When he reached into the front pocket of his jeans and pulled out his Barlow knife. My father used this blade to stab the Manitou, and yet you keep talking about Tok'pai. What am I dealing with, McGeesy? Men or monsters? McGeesy studied the knife for a few moments. Perhaps both. Both men and monsters came from me back on Deadwood Island. I would gladly lay down my life to stop the killing, but we must weather the coming storm. The final fight will not happen this generation. I'm not willing to wait 100 years to do my part, Wally said, standing up. He embraced McGeesy before leaving. A few minutes later, when Wally stopped at the Nimrod Road, a 1950 Plymouth, dark blue, drove past his stopped truck at full speed, heading north. Its driver wore a derby hat. Huh. A herring? Chapter 35, Blood Brothers, Split Rock High School, November 3rd, 1961. Things didn't get better after MEA break. The two murders clouded everything. Chris Looning even noticed angry flashes exchanged by his friends as he approached them at their lockers. What's that all about? Jimmy looked over at Biff before answering. Nothing. Sure sounded like something, Chris thought as the three walked to the cafeteria together. By the time they arrived in the lunchroom, half of the student body was sitting at tables with trays, and the other half was standing in line. Jimmy and his friends punctuated the end of the line. While they waited, Chris chirped out theories about the coming NFL games, especially about the Vikings. Jimmy nodded to keep Chris going. What are they hiding from me? When they sat down, Chris finally stopped talking, mainly to eat. Classmates Carrie Jensen and Dale Nace had shoveled down their food, and before Chris had even taken a few bites, the two bolted toward the side door of the Commons for recess, leaving the three buddies almost alone. Normally, Biff led the charge outside to play football, but today, he took his time eating crinkle-cut fries one by one. So, what do you think happened to Rory? Jimmy finally asked. Charlie Morrison thinks it's some sort of pervert, Chris offered. Some weirdo who lives by himself, and from time to time, he gets in his car and drives around looking for a boy who's all alone. Somebody like a janitor? Biff asked. Jimmy glanced across the dining room to the senior high tables, and Chris followed the glances. Standing behind the rolling garbage cans with a push broom propped in his hands, Cameron Guerin meekly watched the students. Chris shook his head. Can man? He's harmless. He's always staring and watching, Biff retorted. Think about it for a minute. What if he were a psycho? He's hiding in plain sight. Lily Guerin's house burns down, the accident at Carousel Park, and Isaac Larson. All three things happened around Can Man. But he had nothing to do with Rory Stewart, Chris countered. You're not just defending him because you've got the hots for Nicky Guerin, Biff challenged. Do not, Chris said, his ears suddenly red. But it was true. His former babysitter had become a babe. Do too, Biff pressed. Just last week, you were talking about her hair. I was just noticing it. For crying out loud, she's a junior and I'm a 7th grader. Besides, I worked with Cameron at Carousel Park. He's odd, but... Jimmy came to the rescue. I gotta agree with Chris. Can Man might be a bit creepy, but he had nothing to do with Rory. That we know of, Biff pressed. It's not him, Jimmy insisted. Biff gave up with a shrug. Who's your suspect, then? Jimmy looked around to make sure no one sat near them. Most of the kids had slipped out the doors for the final 10 minutes of recess. What if it's not a person doing all of this? Thoughts of the spooky shadows lurking in the trees and the raven back at the state park entered Chris's mind. He's right. Something more sinister is behind this. What, like the wolf man? Biff teased and then hit Jimmy hard in the fleshy part of his shoulder. Ow, what was that for? For being a dumbass. Has Jimmy seen something too? Jimmy didn't cower to a bully, though, and turned his conversation to Chris. What if Wally Crane was trying to tell us something? Jimmy started. And I'm not talking about the survival skills or tying knots. What if those stories about the Manitou were meant to warn us? Warn us about what? Chris suddenly became aware of his full bladder and the contents of his stomach churned. The conversation made him want to run away. You know, all those Indian legends, the story about the Sioux women looking for their lost children, the The story about Wally's dad getting attacked by the Manitou when he saw those men performing a ritual. The porcupine men who hide in the woods. Chris felt his throat constrict. The Tokpai, he said softly. Yeah, the Tokpai, Jimmy repeated. What if those stories weren't meant to scare us before bedtime? What if they were meant to educate us? Did you see something? Chris asked, almost in a whisper. Jimmy hesitated and looked down. Biff grew sullen and looked away. He saw something. What'd you see? Chris asked. We probably shouldn't tell you, Biff said, glancing from Jimmy to Chris. Chris grew angry, remembering how he'd been abandoned that night. You're my pals. Pals aren't supposed to keep secrets. Jimmy sighed and looked at Biff, whose mouth tightened as he shook his head. We swore never to talk about it, Biff revealed. Hey, Chris said, holding out his hand and then bending his thumb to display a white scar at the knuckle joint. We're blood brothers, and not just some pansy thumbprick either. Each of us have the same scar on our knuckles so we don't forget our pals. My knuckle overrules any verbal promise that was made. Biff looked away. We made the promise with Rory, Jimmy clarified. Oh, Chris said, shamed and suddenly jealous. This doesn't have anything to do with his death, does it? 'Cause if so, we gotta tell somebody. I don't want to tell you because I don't want to involve you, Jimmy said, avoiding the first question. They don't trust me with their big secret. Well, I give you permission to involve me then. Neither of you are smart enough to figure out what's going on here, apparently. So either you need to tell me or tell an adult. Biff suddenly relented with a nod, and immediately Jimmy leaned in to whisper. We were camping at Turtle Island State Park. We snuck out in the middle of the night and broke into Haggard Quarry. What? We were planning on waking you, but you were sleeping in the tent beside Wally, and we didn't think we'd be able to wake you up without waking him, Biff said. No, they thought I'd rat on them. Biff is still upset about the Rice Krispie bars incident. Jimmy continued. We hopped in a canoe and paddled across the lake, and before we knew it, we were sneaking under the security fence and into the quarry. Why? Chris asked. Rory said there was some sort of treasure that they were guarding. I knew better, but Jimmy called bullshit, Biff explained. Sure enough, security guards came out of nowhere. They were watching the quarry as if it was a bank vault. We got separated, though, and they've only found Rory and me. Where were you? Chris asked Jimmy. Again, Jimmy looked around before lowering his voice. At first, I threw myself into the shadows beside some shack, but then I crawled into a hole in the lattice and hid under it. I saw the armed guards come and take Rory and Biff, so I held tight, but while I waited, I heard something whispering to me in the dark. It came from behind me, and I found an entrance to a tunnel. The shack was built right up against a stone wall, but from underneath the foundation, I was able to slip out from under it and on the other side of a locked door. Was it a cave? No, it was man-made. See, they're hiding the entrance so that no one knows what they are doing. The rest of the quarry is just a distraction. They're digging under Lake Manitou. A tunnel to what? Where did... Chris almost formed another nervous question, but knew the answer. And you heard a voice coming from the tunnel? What voice? Biff asked, agitated. Jimmy didn't tell Biff this part, Chris realized. It was a whisper, but it was more than my imagination. It came from the tunnel, I swear. For a while, I didn't believe it myself, which is why I didn't tell you what I found, Jimmy said, glancing at Biff. But I've been having really weird dreams lately, and there are times when I can hear the voice whispering to me in the dark. Biff muttered a profanity under his breath. Chris now had to squeeze his thighs to control his full bladder. What are we going to do? We? You didn't go there. It was me, Biff, and Rory. And now Rory's dead, along with Isaac Larson and those 4 other people who died in the roller coaster accident. That's 6 people. And if Wally's stories are true, there'll be 6 more before... Before what? Chris prompted Jimmy. Before the Manitou wakes. Biff shook his head. I don't believe the Manitou killed those people. Are you saying I'm a liar? Jimmy asked. No, I'm not saying you're lying. I'm just saying Old Copper Road is haunted by 6 Sioux women looking for their 12 children, right? Wally didn't say the Manitou killed them. He said some Chippewa cult leaders sacrificed them at Bleeding Rock, the same place where Isaac died. What if someone is trying to wake the Manitou? The lunch hour was almost done, and Chris needed to use the bathroom. So he rose, but not before saying, That's why they're targeting kids? That's right, Biff said. Now you know the secret. You need to promise me something. What? Chris asked, shifting his legs. Maybe Jimmy's right. Maybe there is some monster causing all this to happen. But if I'm right, and it is some psycho cult leader out there doing this, then Rory died because we snuck into the quarry. There were 5 or 6 adults there that night, but none of them knew Jimmy was there, right? So if something happens to me, then you know the killer is a real person. If something happens to both of us, then you need to get the hell out of Hiawatha County, even if you have to run away and live on the railroads like a hobo, okay? We need to tell somebody about this, Chris insisted, glancing at the restroom. Promise me, Biff repeated. We should talk to Wally about this, Chris dodged. He seemed to know about the Manitou, right? And what if the Manitou is real, Jimmy asked. What then? We need to tell him about the tunnel, don't we? Maybe he'll know what to do. We're blood brothers, Jimmy said sternly. Make the promise, Chris. His bladder demanded attention. Okay, if something happens to either of you, I'll become a hobo and leave. I'm not going to let anything happen to either of you. We're going to stick together and not let anything come between us because I made a promise too. Jimmy and Biff were caught off guard. When you guys snuck out, I think I saw a talk pie and something else. I think I had a vision. You kept this to yourself all this time? Biff asked, a wrinkle of concern appearing on his forehead. I was mad that you guys didn't want to wake me up to come with you. Biff sighed. If we brought you, it might be you dead now instead of Rory. Chris offered his hand with his pinky extended. Pinky swear? Jimmy looked around. At the second-floor railing, he saw Mrs. Crane looking down at them. People are watching, Chris. We'll pinky swear some other time, okay? We'll talk about this more after school. Chris withdrew his pinky and rushed off to the restroom. Chapter 36, Protective Gear. Split Rock, Minnesota, November 11th, 1961. Albert Fisher stood at the window in his study, examining the old brick wall as a cold wind came through the window panes. At one end of his study, a brick fireplace held the embers of a fire that had warmed his room for his morning breakfast coffee at his mahogany desk. The fireplace also contained the ashes of the morning paper, which updated Hiawatha County about a possible serial killer preying on young boys. As a boy, Albert knew the fear of death. His fear of Lake Manitou and the talk pie motivated him to reuse the bricks from the old convent to build a new mansion that not only overlooked Split Rock like a watchtower, but also stood beside the old willow tree. He felt safer knowing that some of the bricks had once belonged to a house of God, for across the Crowing River, on the other side of the valley, the Manitou still whispered to him in his dreams. But I can't hide here all day. I have to see if my dreams are warnings. His gaze shifted from the bricks to the outside world of his sanctuary. A dusting of snow covered the lawn. The weeping willow in the center of the yard bowed low, its tendril branches touching the ground. The snowfall had come before many of the trees lost their leaves, and while several oak and maple branches snapped off from the weight, the willow simply drooped as it bore its burden. If he had his druthers, he would not step outside for the rest of winter, or else simply go south for the winter with his wife Eunice. But with Lily recovering from her burns, Albert knew the responsibility as the eldest member of the Asante Lodge fell on his shoulder, and since the burden was heavy, he needed to move or be crushed by its weight. Eunice and her book club members were having tea in the parlor, but none of them took note as he slipped out of his study through the main dining room and out into the garage. Even though he paid for a maid and a groundskeeper, either of which were willing to drive, Albert knew he had to go alone today. The attached garage had two newer cars, a Buick Roadmaster and a Mercedes-Benz, which he and his wife frequently used, but Albert went through that garage until he reached the side door. Elmer Johnson, the groundskeeper, had shoveled the path to a storage garage, leaving him no excuse but to keep going. The storage garage was the last vestige of the old convent that sat tucked away by the trees planted behind the estate. When he reached the door, he found it unlocked. Johnson jumped when the door opened, hitting his head against the motor shield of the snowblower he was working on. "Mr. Fisher, is there something I can help you with?" "Yes, I would like to take the LaSalle out for a spin. Could you pull it forward and help me with the door?" My father's car. It was a symbol of decadent wealth, and Albert couldn't bring himself to part with it. "You want me to take you someplace, Mr. Fisher? I'm only fine-tuning the motor on the snowblower before winter arrives." "Absolutely not. Keep tinkering. I simply want to take the car out for a spin. If all this October rain had been snow, I'd be buried in my house until it melted in March." "Well, I'd say it's safe to take it out now, Mr. Fisher. I think it would cheer folks up to see it cruising around the streets of Split Rock." "Is it ready to go?" "Should be. I serviced all the brakes back in July and was just about to rotate through them prior to winter until this snowblower gave me fits. Let me get the door, and I'll bring it out for you." The green and black LaSalle purred. A little smoke came from the tailpipe, but for as long as it sat, that was to be expected. As soon as he settled upon the seat, the magic of the LaSalle turned him from a 70-year-old man into a teen. Hoping Eunice and her friends did not see the car sneaking down the driveway, he gave Johnson a nod and crept away from his estate. In spite of there being no stop sign, Albert paused at the intersection of North Division and 7th Avenue, a new street built along the ridge overlooking the valley. Owning 20 acres of wooden land at the top of the ridge did not prevent the new houses to the north of his driveway from seeming like intruders. They gave the impression that Split Rock was vibrant and growing when in reality, old houses rotted like tumors on the aging town. Not wanting to put the brakes to the test, Albert turned south. He hardly needed to put his foot on the accelerator for the LaSalle to be out of the town. A block away from his driveway, Lyons Park looked much as it did when he was a child, yet the old oak trees had grown into adult oak trees and replace the thick canopy that covered the merry-go-round swings and the tallest slide in all of Hiawatha County. There wasn't a single child playing in the park, and it occurred to Albert that he wasn't sure if it was a weekday or a weekend. The park ended at Chicago Street, and Albert slowly passed by the 3-story house that had belonged to Hazel Sloan. Once, the house had belonged to Doc Jenkins, but when he hung himself from the trestle bridge during the Great Depression, the rich old woman purchased the home for herself. For 3 decades, nary a repair or improvement had been made to the estate, and if Hazel Sloan hadn't been as old as she was, Albert would have suspected her of the foul deeds happening around Lake Manitou. But Albert knew better. Hazel Sloan wasn't to blame. He knew a real sorceress named Lily. Her absence allowed evil to return. Evil clings to the bricks of this community like lichen. Are my dreams echoes of the past or omens of the future? He turned onto South Street and rode the brakes for 5 blocks until he came to the stop sign at East Division Street. He looked north, where the traffic from the school, churches, and downtown districts would funnel their way out of town. He looked south, where small companies would pop up in hopes of becoming the town's next industry. He let off the brakes and continued rolling down the hill toward the Crow Wing River. At Market Street, he had to wait for passing traffic on Highway 19 to lighten before he crept across the busiest road in town. He paused at the railroad tracks that once sent thousands of dollars of lumber out of southern Minnesota each day. Now, the lumber left on trucks and trains would only stop here once in a week, but during the summer, and once a month during the winter. At the bottom of the wooded ravine, he passed over the old iron bridge, now known as Doc Jenkins Bridge. His recent dreams about the creamery proved unfounded. It's still standing. No explosions, no disasters. An echo from the past. The parking lot was full. The milk trucks came and went, and the smokestacks from the boilers puffed away as they'd done for decades. Albert never took the LaSalle out of gear as he made a leisurely loop around the factory and went out of the way he'd come. At the entrance of Dutch Boy Creamery, he gave a long glance at Old Copper Road. He wanted to patrol the old road that led to the distant Turtle Island, but he knew the heavy rains would have turned it into a muddy mess. So he chose discretion over valor and went back toward town. After passing over the bridge and railroad tracks, he turned south onto Market Street and drove for 2 long blocks until he reached the place where the tracks crossed over the highway out of town. Here, he turned past the fading wooden sign that read Fisher Lumberyard. Past the tracks, the train depot allowed the lumber cars to be brought to the back of the massive warehouse building. More than a dozen men were still employed full-time to fill the local orders and organize the factory for a building boom that likely would never come. Perhaps my dreams of doom were economic, Albert speculated. Fisher Lumberyard was built upon a jut of land caused by a loop in the Crow Wing River. On the flat piece of land, his father had built several small docks and chutes to collect the lumber from the sawmill on the north side of the town at Split Rock Creek. Smaller buildings housed saws that turned the raw lumber into smaller pieces of wood. The road came to an end at the house Albert once called home, but now belonged to his son-in-law, Marlin Looning. Before Albert parked the car, Marlin opened the front door and stepped out into the deck. Robust for 50, Marlin Looning had a full head of silver hair swept over to one side. His thick mustache and goatee matched his silver hair. Behind him, Christopher had jet black hair that his father once had. "Good morning, Al," Marlin said, and then loudly cleared his throat. "What brings you all the way out here on this fine Saturday?" "I needed to get out of the house while the weather held. A little gloomy today, but at least it's not raining anymore." Albert stood 20 yards from the front door, and the roar of the Crow Wing River caused both of them to almost shout. "Do you want to come in for a cup of coffee?" "Actually, I was wondering if you could give me a little tour of the plant." Marlin looked at his son. "Chris, run inside and pour 2 cups of coffee for your grandpa and me. Pick the mugs with the lids. Ask your mother for help if you can't find them." Chris vanished from the doorway, and Marlin stepped down from the porch to where Albert stood on the other side of the painted picket fence surrounding the yard. From where Albert stood, his former home was picturesque and beautiful, with the Crow Wing River and the granite bluffs forming a wall behind them. But all he needed to do was pivot to have the scene turn to the backside of a factory. "Hear anything from Chuck?" Marlin asked. "Eunice wants to fly to Fort Benning for either Thanksgiving or Christmas." "Well, that would be lovely. Georgia is certainly going to have some better weather than Minnesota. If you're making the trip, could Betsy and I send some presents for Carson and you?" "Certainly. It's hard to believe my great-grandson is already in kindergarten, isn't it?" "It certainly is. Chuck is learning how to fly helicopters. When he's done with his stint in the service, he'll have a very lucrative career in aviation. The military has at least got his head in the right direction now." Helen and Eunice are walking on eggshells. "I'm worried my great-grandson is going to grow up not knowing any of us because Eunice doesn't know when to keep her mouth shut." "I'm glad Helen and Chuck are finding a way to make it work out. So am I." Chris Looning came through the door with 2 cups of coffee. "This one has milk and honey in it for you, Grandpa." "Betsy certainly has a memory, doesn't she?" "She has her moments," Marlin sighed, and then turned his attention to Chris. "Go ahead and keep watching the Gophers game without me." "Is your football season over?" Albert asked before Chris left. Yeah, junior high doesn't have a playoff. Our seventh grade team went undefeated this year. Well, maybe you boys can bring Split Rock another championship like your big brother Chuck did. I'm sure to do my part. I bet you will. Chris bolted back to the house, jumping over all three steps on the porch to show off a little. I'd give my life to keep him safe. Wally is right. We must protect these children. The previous generation had grown up too quickly. Paul Forsberg and Chris Looning were supposed to take our places. Would this have been Chuck's senior year at the U of M? You're not here to talk about Chuck or football, are you, Albert? No, I'm not, Albert admitted and walked towards the plant. Both men put on their protective gear, hard hats, earplugs, and goggles. The sound of the saw blades replaced the sound of the river, bringing comfort to Albert. Water chutes still connected the two sawmills, and once winter froze everything solid, work would come to a complete halt at the northern plant. Inside the warehouse, Albert and Marlin were greeted by the familiar faces of men who'd worked for the company for decades. The large rectangular building had a receiving chute at the northern side where the finished lumber would arrive from the smaller saws to be sorted, stacked, and dried. On the southern end of the building, a semi-truck with a large flatbed trailer waited to be filled. Albert walked up to the stairs that led to the old factory office near the ceiling. By the time he reached the third level, Albert had to clutch the railing that overlooked the warehouse, while Marlin patiently waited for him to remove the protective gear and get to his point. Albert reached inside his jacket to fumble at his collar, and when his fingers found the leather band, he pulled the wooden cross hidden against his chest. Your father gave me this cross. He made it himself. Yeah, I know the story well. He used to tell me the story when he was a kid. He gave it to me to comfort me when I was a boy, but now I'm an old man, and the same fears keep me up at night. What has Sheriff Betzing learned about the death of the Stewart boy? Despite his incredulity toward anything paranormal, Marlin was still a valuable asset to the Santee Lodge, especially with his connections to the Sheriff's Department. They had a few leads and a person of interest. Betzing said they were looking for a blue Plymouth. It was another rental car checked out by someone matching the description of that fella in the red Thunderbird. The Indian fella? Albert asked, realizing how the word meant something else to most in America. No, the English smoker that the Garans described, the driver. Ah, a blue Plymouth. It might just be a rogue predator. Might, Albert repeated. Do you know, each tree that goes through this warehouse feels like a little victor to me? I know the environmental groups speak of responsible harvesting, but none of those experts ever stood in the old forest and heard the whispers in the pines. If I had my druthers, we'd rip out every tree between Lake Manitou and Leech Lake, leaving no place for the shadows to hide. The shadows would simply find a new places to hide, Albert. My father became business partners with Triton Corporation, and since that day, I've lived most of my life in fear. I worry about those people. Those people? Edna Forsberg is a haggard. We can't see the strings of the puppet master. Something is happening, Marlin, and I know in my heart that Triton Corporation is behind it. I had a dream about the creamery exploding, and a flood of children came out of it, pouring into the Crow-Wing River. Wasn't there an explosion there years ago? Perhaps your brain is just reflecting on childhood fears. When I was a child, I saw real monsters. Real monsters, both in the woods and in the water. You've spent your whole life blissfully unaware of the truth about this place, but I know different. Even though you weren't born when your father gave this to me, I feel as if it should be yours. Or, give it to Chris for protection. Albert pulled the pendant over his head and handed it to Marlin, who accepted it reluctantly. If it is a family heirloom, shouldn't I give it to Chuck? Chuck is far away from Lake Manitou. Chris isn't. I know you think I'm a foolish old man, but I can feel evil growing by the day, and it is our children who will pay the price for our lack of vigilance. Stay watchful, Marlin. Stay watchful. Marlin steered the conversation back to business, and after stuffing the crucifix into his inner pocket, spent the next 30 minutes updating Albert on business. Although Farrell Looning had been a hard man, his heart was tender and his mind was open, unlike his son, who grew up in the shadow of the mill. Long before Chuck Looning had ever gotten Helen Ellis pregnant, Albert grew to adore his eldest grandson for being similar to Farrell. Chuck even looked like his childhood hero, whereas Chris looked more like Albert's daughter, Betsy. The bond between Farrell and Albert broke when Marlon impregnated Albert's only child out of wedlock. The scandal passed to the next generation when Chuck did the same thing, impregnating the sister of his African-American roommate during a summer football camp in North Carolina. While Marlon bemoaned the loss of Chuck's football scholarship to the U of M, Albert lost a potential ally and replacement for Farrell in the Asante Lodge. Now, hopes rest with Chris. When Albert returned to the LaSalle, he did not head back up the hill to the house, or even though it was late in the afternoon. Instead, he turned north on Market Street and drove until he reached the extreme northern end of town. At the intersection of Market and North Division, he crossed Train Bridge, which was a parallel bridge that allowed both cars and trains to cross the Crow Wing River. The bypass allowed train cars to be diverted from the main railroad tracks leading north to Leech Lake and either supply or retrieve lumber from the old mill. At the top of the hill, the old log chute passed 20 feet above his head and descended all the way back to the lumber yard. Descending the bluff, he saw the towering red building of Fisher's sawmill. Marlin had recently suggested they close the old mill and turn it into a historical park. For the first time in 60 years, Albert returned to the place where he almost died. Omadai. Those words echoed in his memories. He'd seen the Tokpai. He'd been hunted by them for weeks before one of them pulled him into the waters of Split Rock Creek, right out from under the noses of his father and Triton businessmen. Only Farrell Looning had acted, jumping at great personal risk into the raging current to save him. Why? The Omadai. Once, Lily believed evil spirits in the water were trying to claim him, to use him as a vessel for resurrection. Lily and her team of Farrell Looning, Father Guerin, Martin Nielsen, Bjorn Forsberg, Blackfish Slabiche, Pierre Leduc fought to keep him from happening. Ultimately, the bad guy snatched McGeesey, sparing Albert another brush with death. Years later, Albert understood the Wintermaker would never want him. But do I have another part to play? Lily and Farrell once saved me, and now I must repay the debt. Without Lily, the loops could be broken. Albert parked his car in the empty lot. He checked his coat pocket for his keys and walked over to the main door. He unlocked it and made a nostalgic tour of the building his father had built decades earlier. The interior of the sawmill was a raw skeleton of beams and boards, almost identical to what it had been 60 years earlier. Once he reached the fourth level, he walked over to the hinged window shutter, and with the support bar lifted it up so he could peer into Lake Manitou. A ring of ice extended from the shallow waters between the shoreline and Deadwood Island and the steep bluffs of Bleeding Rock. In the distance, he could see a solitary fisherman standing beside a bucket on ice that could only be a few inches thick. Life and death will hang in the balance of the sawmill, an apparition under the willow tree had told him. Albert knew and loved Lily. He trusted her. He trusted everyone in the Asante Lodge, but the boy in the snakeskin boots? He wasn't sure. His gaze finally fixed on the rock and concrete dam that had been built along Split Rock Creek, the namesake for the town. Defying the laws of physics, the creek seemingly cut right through granite in a series of falls before reaching Crow Wing River. Although the main outlet for the lake, his father had built a small dam that powered the mill and lifted the water level at the mouth of the creek to allow logs to be wrangled from the lake. Thick metal planks across a channel not much wider than 10 yards held back the entire lake. Albert turned around and walked to the eastern side of the mill, lift the same hinged window shutter, and looked down at the angry creek. Without Lily, the loops would be broken and all their efforts, past, present, and future, would be destroyed. Someone must destroy the Wintermaker, or Lily would survive to be an old woman, but they all assumed she would live until the Serpent Star, commonly known as Halley's Comet, returned in 1986. The Wintermaker and his servants had been caught off guard years ago when Lily and the others stood up to fight. The Asante Lodge might have been ready to put up another fight in a quarter of a century, but evil had other plans. The great battle can't be happening now. How do I fix this? Even though he would be reprimanded by Eunice for his unexplained absence, he lingered at the window for an hour as the October sun set. If the Takpai were to appear, they would come at twilight. Yet only the water stirred. Albert returned to the LaSalle slightly morose but also relieved. The engine purred with just a twist of his wrist, and the headlights lit and faded red paint of the old mill. He turned widely and slowly, bouncing over the diversion tracks built into the parking lot. He saw a solitary truck parked at the boat launch, undoubtedly the vehicle belonging to the reckless fisherman back at the channel. As the old LaSalle climbed up the steep hill of the bluff, its lights illuminated the old log chute over the road. As a boy, he always wanted to get a sled and rock it from the mill to the lumberyard. A gray shadow came out of the thick trees. At first, Albert thought it was a deer, but when he saw another come from the left side of the road, he knew what he saw. The third hunched Takpai, with strange hair like porcupine quills, elongated fingers, and squatty legs, came over the hill toward him. The three creatures with long snouts like wolves snarled as they blocked his passage. McGeesy gripped the steering wheel, knowing his LaSalle was more of a weapon than any knife or gun. Yet he'd stopped halfway up the hill, and if he gunned it, he might stall the engine. Behind him at the boat launch, he'd be able to turn around and then gun it for 100 yards, scattering the ancient creatures that could not comprehend the power of a GMC engine. Calmly stepping on the clutch with his left foot while keeping his right foot on the brake, he shifted the car in reverse. Glancing at his rear mirror, the boat launch lit up in a soft red glow. Suddenly, a fourth Takpai slammed at his window. In panic, Albert stepped on the accelerator, and while he left the fourth Takpai behind, he was sent hurtling down the hill. When his good sense returned, his foot shifted back to the brake, but the snow and ice on the landing provided no friction for his tires, and in a heartbeat, he saw the landing and truck pass by his windows. He heard the crackling of ice and felt the LaSalle lurch backwards, its headlights pointing towards the stars. As water rushed around the windows, Albert clutched at his chest, only to remember the oak crucifix was no longer there to protect him. This is the end of Part 8.